Get your affairs in order. Be prepared to die. My mom says, I've picked the date. It's May 30th. We had a panic attack the day she went into hospital. This year has been our apprenticeship with grief. It wasn't just one thing. It was many things. We drank champagne and ate pie for an evening. And then the playlist ran out and it moved on to the next song. Billy Joel sang about Vienna, holding my mother's hand as she's passing, tears streaming down my face, watching her slowly stop breathing. I didn't want to commit fully to this being the end. It was still this stark before and after moment. 3 weeks of uncertainty. And then suddenly it becomes something that we need to heal from. I think so. You're offering what advice would I give to my past self who's about to go through this next chapter? And everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the face. And I think that is an apt quote for these kinds of chapters, is especially in my case because I was able to see what was coming, and there was all sorts of stories and ideas about what that was going to look like. That there was still the moment of oh, okay, here we are. I didn't know that this was going to be the feeling, or that I was going to be confronted by these challenges. The circumstances that you find yourself in is just part of the experience. And I think the tagline that we talked about in the beginning of this, when we spoke the other day, we were talking about what would you call this, and it was the hidden gifts of grief. And I think one of the gifts that I've come across is by going through the experience, that's how you gain the sort of, perspective or the wisdom or whatever the gifts are. It's you kind of just have to live the thing. And so regardless of what the plans are, the stories are, there is just the truth of the experience. And you can't, you can think as much as you want about that in the forecasting event. It's kind of, it's a lesson for so many things in life. It's a lot of things you just have to do. At the end of the day, you can think about all the art that you want to make, but until you start making the art, you're not actually going to learn the things that you need to do to get to the other side of the output where you're yeah, this is great. You just have to, it's the practice of doing, which is, I think, a very meaningful lesson in life. It's go forth and experience, learn from the experience, as opposed to sitting on the sidelines and analyzing and thinking about. And our friend Kiri gave me this lovely phrase more than a year ago. Well, actually, no, it wasn't. It was because it was after Jenna died. And she said, this year has been our apprenticeship with grief, which I really love, because I think that there is you're in the thick of that experience, you're learning a lot of things. And whether that's short-term coping strategies or sort of long-term lessons in life, or just how to survive for the day. It is just it's an apprenticeship, as in you're on the ground, doing the thing. And this apprenticeship has lasted, more than 3 years, 4 years. It was in 2022, my mom went into hospital in January for an elective surgery. She had some big quality of life challenges, some nerve issues that were lots of symptoms not very well diagnosed or heard in the healthcare system, and decided to go for surgery. And it was one of the few times that I've ever felt much premonition, but I had basically had a panic attack the day she went into hospital. And I was this is weird. I have faith in our medical system, and I don't know why, but it just was I was unnerved. And with great relief, the next morning, my dad called and was my stepdad called and said, yeah, she came out of hospital, she came out of surgery, everything's great. And I was oh, phew, okay. Yeah. Overreacting. But that was the starting point of what ended up being a year and a half of, almost a year in hospital for my mom. She had complications after the surgery and ended up back in hospital, and it was during COVID, and lots of just veering paths in the road for her. And it was the beginning of that trajectory, which ultimately saw her, confined to a hospital bed in a hospital and then in the living room at home for a year and a half before she decided to go ahead with MAID. So she had a medical assisted death, which was a powerful thing to experience firsthand. The decision-making process leading up to that choice for her and how long a chapter that was before she actually took the step, and then still how sudden it felt in the moment when she finally made the choice. And all that preceded my stepfather's decline with dementia, which had been happening while my mom was in hospital. But obviously my mom's medical needs were overshadowing my stepfather's. And so it's not like we didn't know that dad was deteriorating, but it was kind of like, well, you're okay. But eventually it was more and more evident that he wasn't okay. And then when my mom passed away and his role of caretaker and responsibility was finally released, his decline was precipitous. And so we had exactly a year with him before he followed suit with a medical assisted death. It was different in both cases. My mom's circumstances, fundamentally, just my mom had full agency and clarity of voice, and my dad, because of dementia, didn't. It was attacking his language centers and his ability to communicate, which was a piece of his isolation and ultimately a big factor in his choice there. But yeah, my mom had lots of opportunity to speak to us about it, even though we didn't have, the robust family conversations for a long period of time. My mom did bring it up when she was in hospital with us, and when she was in hospital, she brought it up with me. We had a really lovely conversation. Like sampling all of these like moments in our story arc over that 2-year period.
Share.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I think one of the like unseating moments for me or unnerving moments for me was I was away. I was working on a remote job. I was literally like on a mountaintop in the middle of the province. And I got sort of a panicked call from my mom, and she was still in hospital at this time. And so she'd been, in a stable chapter, but obviously very worried about her. So I pick up the phone, walk down the ridgeline so I can get some decent reception. And my mom had just had this like really shitty conversation with a doctor who was basically like, get your affairs in order, be prepared to die. And in that moment, my mom was like, I don't want to die. I'm not ready for this. And I don't, like, fuck this guy for telling me that this is the direction that I have to make peace with. And I was like, that is a choice. You can struggle and fight, or make purposeful direction towards healing, or there's room in the conversation for that, and I think some opportunity. But that was I think that was the first time that we really had a conversation about like my mom's fear of dying and her sense of mortality, and which was an interesting juxtaposition because my mom had challenging health, condition for, maybe 8 years leading up to that. And I always said that those moments were like, they were quality of life threatening as opposed to life threatening. But in this moment, they were really turning the corner on what that meant. And she had chapters in the ICU leading up to that. And so it was some like pretty serious health scares before we even got to that moment. But that was like the first day that we had a real conversation about, was she ready to die? And if so, what did that mean? And the conversation on that mountaintop for me, which was like, how do I support this person from afar? It was one of those moments where you really want to be in the room with this person that you care about and connecting with them. But at the end of the day, the phone call was more than enough of a connection point for us to unpack some of that. And then 2 days later, I was in Vancouver again, having that conversation face to face. I mean, ranging disbelief. This through line over that like 2-year period, essentially from those first conversations to in, I guess it would have been late April of 2024. My mom says, I've picked the date. It's May 30th. I'm going to go ahead with MAID. And in that moment, I was like, whoa, 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 whoa. Like this is way too soon, even though we had like a 2-year chapter to talk about all those things. But I think up till that point, it had always been this horizon line that was quite far out. And we were sort of talking about it in uncertain terms. And it was still a moment in the future. And then suddenly it was like, oh no, okay, this is 3 weeks away or 4 weeks away. How do I feel about that? And there was a big part of me that was wrestling with like, well, oh, maybe this isn't true. We're not going to do this. So like, do I embrace the saying goodbye portion of this storyline with my mom, or do I, work to convince her to do something else, or what's my role here? Starts populating all these questions about what does it mean to support someone in those decisions, or to like put my own expectations on what the outcome should be. Obviously, like I loved my mom. I didn't want to say goodbye to her, but I also wanted her to have a better quality of life that she was having. So I understood why she would be making those decisions, but it was still like confronting in the timeline. I think the interesting thing is that was just 3 weeks of uncertainty, because I think as a protective mechanism, I didn't want to like commit fully to this being the end. I was like, well, there's a possibility she might change her mind. And in hindsight, it's easy to say, oh, she was expressing, clear conviction. And I think she waited to have some of those conversations with us because she was worried we weren't going to accept them, we being my dad and I, and some other family members, my uncle. And so there was like uncertainty and disbelief. And then I sort of mentioned a moment ago, like these expectations that we have about what end of life should look like. I certainly had some like movie, resolution, like, oh, we're going to have this great like conversation that's going to kind of clear the air, old family dramas or things that you just wish for other people that they make peace with. And I kind of, for a while, I was like, oh, these things are going to happen. And like, oh, we still have 3 weeks. We still have 2 weeks. We still have a week. And then thinking that last week, it was like, oh, right. Like, no, this has been my mom's whole life. She's been this person. And so I think she's going to embrace this as the person she's always been. Why would she suddenly make this major character change just because that was my idea about it? And so again, all these things just to say like accepting of what that other person's journey is going to be was an interesting process for me to engage. It was very easy for me to, like, I had my grief around losing my mom, saying goodbye to this person who had been, there for me in the most fundamental ways my entire life. My mom, even though I had left home at 17 and hadn't like moved back with them at any stage, like my mom was always my biggest supporter. And like, if I ever needed to feel better about something, I would call up her and have nice chats. And so I was definitely losing that sense of support in life. My mom, like all the things that are great about having a mom. But I also recognized that she had been not thriving for a long time. And so I think I had an appreciation for the MAID program since I was a university student learning sort of about ethics and people's right to choose and whatever. And this was a big discourse in the 2000s in Canada, and Canadian politics was like, what's the right thing for us to do? And how do we support people's dignity and death? And so when that part of it came, I was like, 100%, I support this decision. I believe it's your decision. I'm not here to belabor it for you. I'm going to show up as best I can to make it easier for you to make that choice. And as opposed to being like, you shouldn't do this and you should feel guilty about leaving us or any, like that would be putting my demands on somebody else's experience. So that was very easy for me to accept, but it's still losing a person who you love dearly and the end of a relationship and I think that was the major shock, was that even though I had many years of my mom in a challenging health scenario and 2 years to get sort of prepared for this moment, and then 3 weeks of like, or 4 weeks or whatever the timeline was of like, it's May 30th. You could see that date coming on the calendar. It was still this like stark before and after moment. Like, the sort of like, wow, this happened. There's a term in mountaineering that I've always loved. Like, when you're climbing up to the summit of something, there's like this committing step. It's like once you cross that line, it's really fucking hard to go back. And this was like, this was my mom's committing step, and she took it with grace and dignity. And, I've thought a lot about what the meaning of like a good death is. There's obviously lots of examples in the world of what like pretty shitty deaths look like. And this one, my mom was at peace. She was at peace with her decision. She was surrounded by people she loved. It was like calm and easeful. And like, what a gift that was to be able to like make peace with that before and after step, and to sort of be there with intention and presence, as opposed to the alternatives, which is to have somebody like stripped from you suddenly with no ability to have any of those meaningful conversations, or just to spend time with somebody with intention. And I'm really appreciative that I got to have that with my mom and my stepdad in such close proximity. It was very different experiences with both, because I got to have all the conversations with my mom, but because of Malcolm's dementia and his inability to communicate, it was just time together. And in both those cases, with my mom, I was able to be there in the room and to have some conversation. And with my dad, I was able to support his right to make that choice. So there was a big advocacy role in working within the healthcare system to navigate his competency kind of requirements, which I, again, very much support. I want to have safeguards for all the people. And I also am so fucking grateful that my dad was able to meet that competency requirement. His dementia really affected his language structure. So he knew what was going on in the room, where he was, who anyone in his life. He actually had better recall for names and addresses and stuff than I do now. But he couldn't answer simple questions sometimes, or quite often he couldn't engage in a full sentence without losing his words. And so it was a challenge to demonstrate that he knew what he was asking for. And the benefit that we had in his case is that he was in the room with my mom 12 months prior to, and in the MAID program, there's not that many people who are managing those cases. We had one of the same women in both my dad's case and my mom's case. And so she was able to say, I know that you were in the room with your wife when she left 12 months before. So you're not confused about what you're asking for. This isn't an abstract concept. This is a lived experience for him. So that was, I think, very fortunate for us to have had the right people involved in sort of like a abstract community level, because in the end, it wasn't, again, lots of like big unpacking conversations about all the meaningful things in life. It was sitting in a room with a man who was losing his ability to connect at all. Still makes me pretty sad. But again, in both those cases, I got to say goodbye and to be with them in a graceful way that I think is a gift that few people get in our day and age with our hermetically sealed geriatric care. I have lots of opinions about how we treat death and how we treat the elderly and whatnot. And so again, in both these cases, I think my parents got really, really good versions of that, while still recognizing that the end of life is a hard chapter, no matter what. Oh, I mean, the administrative challenges are quite complex, and I think in both cases, I think there was, despite an effort to have some of those conversations, it was a very challenging subject matter for both my mom and dad. And so like end of life planning and estate planning and advance directives and all of those things seem like, oh yeah, we've got lots of time to make those decisions. But in my dad's case, like we had some chats when my mom was going, and he had actually brought up that he wanted to go with her, because I think he could see the writing on the wall that his dementia was going to continue to deteriorate. It was a one-way street, and my mom was like, no. This is my thing. I want you to live, as full a life as you can. And so it didn't really come up for quite a few months after my mom passed. There was, life logistics, moving out of an apartment into a support facility and selling things and downsizing and grieving, most importantly. And it was only when my dad's symptoms got really, really bad that it was like, oh, I want to talk about MAID. And in that moment, it was very complicated because he was really losing his ability to communicate. I had lost so much ground that there was almost like, there was a moment where we're like, is this actually what we're talking about? Or are you just like referencing some things from last year? And so, all these concepts about advanced directives and like clarity of purpose in wills and whatnot can get really complicated or muddy. And I think they both had wills, but they were old and outdated. And, they were more than a decade past. And they're the documents that we have been working with. It was a choice we ultimately made, not because of my dad's state and a few other things, and the proximity to the end for both my mom and dad. Rewriting wills in that moment was just going to be a pretty significant project. I think in the time as well, like, not really understanding the tools available with estate planning and sort of legal advising and all of that kind of stuff. Like in hindsight, I wish we'd engaged more of those people earlier on, even just to get perspective, because there was a few folks that were well-meaning and gave advice that I thought in our family, in our family circumstances, people that I thought were sort of a little bit more knowledgeable in the way they presented things were like, oh yeah, this isn't going to be a problem. In hindsight, was a lot more complicated than it needed to be. You're asking about the sort of the unexpected complexity of now this chapter and the executorship. So we are going through an executorship that we have family members that were identified in the wills as executor, and they've taken that role on. And I was deeply involved in the admin leading up to the passing of both my parents, and so we've been working together, and that's all fine and good. But having an estate plan in place could have saved us a lot of complexity and cost after the fact. There's definitely, we're paying lawyers to do probate and all of the things now when we could have had some clarity earlier on. And again, some of those conversations are hard to have. I think, we attempted to have those conversations as a family a few years before the really serious health implications came up. And it seemed like we had lots of time to put that off. But because of not wanting to talk about money and not wanting to make things challenging and not wanting to talk about death with family, made those things get parked for longer and longer periods. And so coming out the other side, there's more complexity now, and it's just taking a lot longer to resolve certain things. Filing taxes on behalf of, two sets of parents, transferring assets from joint ownership when my mom passed away into sole ownership, and now along to the next generation. There's a lot of layers to that are, we could have clarified much, much sooner and just had a very easeful transition, as opposed to just, now we have the time to make some of those decisions. And, in my case, I think having a sense of purpose around some of those things was like, a meaningful way to channel in some of my angst. It was like, oh, I'm being productive. I'm making a positive difference here. I'm going to go and look at tax code and figure out how to contact the District of North Vancouver to figure out whether or not we owe vacancy tax on the property. Those things felt like pieces on the board that I could move, while some of those other things, the inability to have a peacemaking conversation with my mom or dad in their last few weeks of life, which were much more abstract. So I think I appreciated having some of those projects as a distraction, but that doesn't mean that I had the attention or the capacity to manage them as well as I would have liked. Yeah. So in the case of having a clear set of beneficiaries for all of the accounts, to having the taxation obligations already identified, so those aren't surprises later. And so we could have avoided things like hiring probate and engaging a lawyer. If we had done it proactively, it just would have been a smaller price tag on the one sense. And secondly, it would have been a simpler set of discussions and mechanisms for after the fact. So we could have, instead of spending months being a bit confused about what the right thing to do was and whether we were going to owe the government a bunch of money or not, it would have just been a fluid set of steps to move through. So you're asking about forms of support that I wish that I had. I think that I was really quite fortunate. I have a partner who had been through a really direct experience with medical assisted dying prior to this chapter in our lives, and so there was a little bit of experience and framing to be able to draw from. And I had her in my life. I made the joke for a little while that I had two therapists because I didn't want to burden her with all of my processing needs. One of those was an actual therapist that I, had found through my community here in Vancouver. And the other was a social worker that was associated with the MAID program. We were able to have some conversations with them specifically around what the MAID process looked like and what tools they had to offer and what they didn't. And so I think, having some formal support on the emotional side was really powerful for me. And also, again, some logistical questions that got answered. Nothing to do with like sort of financing or estate planning or any of that kind of stuff. That I definitely would have benefited or appreciated some larger clarification on estate transition. But on the emotional side, I have a great partner. I had, a couple of therapists, and I have a stubborn self-sufficiency, which was like, I'm going to go sort of circle my resources and go into a bit of a withdrawn protective chapter and take care of myself, because I've been socialized to believe that like self-sufficiency is a high value. And so I chose to go through it that way, which worked for me. But I think that everybody's experience is wildly different. And I have, in comparison to the experience of my parents dying, we had a friend suddenly die in between those two planned deaths. We had a friend die very unexpectedly in a very challenging way. And to watch our community come together and support one another through that, totally, we were not predicting that was coming. We were not prepared for the aftermath of it. And to watch our social fabric really knit together around that was quite fortunate. And again, I think we got lucky in the resources of our community to be able to navigate that. But I mean, lots of folks don't have those things. Yeah. So sort of holding up the different experiences with grief, some seeing those potential losses coming, or seeing the losses coming, versus suicide as a counterpoint of that somebody being suddenly taken from us. We have another example. While I was grieving my stepfather's death and my mother's death, another friend of ours lost her dad, who was in his 60s, very suddenly. And we had a brief exchange around that time. And I was like, I said, I feel like I had such an easeful version of this compared to the sudden and unexpected version that you've had to deal with, and the total destabilization that comes with. I think, not that comparing grief is really a worthwhile project, but there is some burden in like seeing the thing coming and the anticipation that comes from that, versus the like, all right, we're just dealing with this. Again, I've been punched in the face, and so now how am I going to stumble through it? But I mean, I had so much time to accept these things and to say goodbye that I certainly don't envy the versions where people are taken from us and we have to suddenly reconcile a life without this person in it anymore. The May 30th, the day my mom chose for her, it was quite fun, if that's the right word. My mom certainly had a spiritual side, and so she really enjoyed the sort of meaning making around that last chapter. We had some. She decided for some reason that she wanted to die with pie, so it was a project for me to run around the city and find like the best selection of pie that I could come up with. We had savory pies and sweet pies, and we had 6 pies for 4 people. It was a bit ridiculous, but we drank champagne and ate pie for an evening and chatted about things. My mom also had a fun time putting together a playlist. And my uncle also made a list of musical selections that were like meaningful music from their lives. My family wasn't particularly like formally religious, but my mom's spiritual side was definitely enjoyed her ritual. And there were some funny moments around that. We made a playlist. It went through as my mom was passing away. The nurse practitioner is there in the room. The medicines are being administered. We're saying goodbye. My mom's drifting off to sleep. We're listening to the playlist. It's all very like sort of meaningful and profound. And then the playlist ran out and it moved on to the next song that was auto-populated. And actually that has now become one of the more meaningful pieces of music for me, because in an odd way, it was so relevant. It's like a bit of a personal thing that I don't know if I'll... Vienna by Billy Joel. It's like, it's just a funny piece of music. I don't like, I've done some writing around this actually. Billy Joel's not a musician that I particularly have much fondness for. Like I probably wouldn't have been able to name any of his music before this moment, but I'm like holding my mother's hand as she's passing on and like listening to Billy Joel sing about Vienna. And I think there's just a couple of interesting taglines in that piece that was like, oh, this kind of applies to this situation. And so now it's become like kind of a cherished piece of music when I didn't really have any connection to that, nor did my mom at the time. So it's just suddenly something that seems inconsequential becomes the most meaningful thing. I think it was a mixture of like obviously overwhelming like sadness, but then also like comedy. And I think that was one of the things that again, these like sort of hidden gems of grief is that my mom's death wasn't just one thing; it was many things. And my dad's death was also not just one sort of moment of sadness or moment of like goodbye. It's in my mom's case, I was like tears streaming down my face, watching her slowly stop breathing. And also having this like sort of subplot of comedy in the background as Billy Joel's waxing on about Vienna waiting for you, which I do have some funny thoughts around the like meaning of, you spend all your life, the lyric is like, you spend all your life running around looking for these great things. And meanwhile, like Vienna's just there. You can just enjoy it. And I was like, yeah, like that could be a moment to describe all these things, these like unmet desires in life, these dreams or stories that we have that, in this moment of reconciliation for my mom, she was like, this is the life I had, start to finish. In that moment of watching someone sort of pass away, all of my expectations about what it should or shouldn't be just like evaporated, because it was like, it doesn't, like this is it. This is this person's life. I get to say goodbye to them, and then I have my chapter. And I'll say goodbye to people when it's my time to go. And like all this imposed structure about what should and shouldn't be is fucking irrelevant. No, I had what were like really poignant moments of sadness in the weeks and months afterwards. And still like I have these moments now, but they're like, I actually really appreciate them. A lot of my relationship with my mom, especially because she was in the latter chapters, she was like less ambulatory and getting around was harder. A lot of our, like the quality time in our conversations were just on the phone. And so I had all these sort of subtle triggers in life where I like come home at the end of the day or after I've been off on an adventure, whatever work or life project is taking me away. And often I'll come home and be like, oh, now's a good time to call my mom. And those would be the moments where we'd have a little catch up. I'd share what was happening for me. She'd share family news or things that she was filled, with joy or sadness or whatever. That was our point of connection. And so those moments still continue to come up for me where I'm like, I should call and in like, a month or two after she died, I was like, fuck, I can't pick up the phone and call my mom anymore because it's not an option. And now those are moments where I get to just think about the lovely chapter that we had together. And that still lives on in my experience of her and those memories and those desires to connect with who she is or was. Or she would often say, forgive me if I told you this before, and then launch into a story that she had absolutely told everyone in the family 14 times before. But I think that there is something, to be cherished about those like oral histories in your family that just come up again and again and again. I mean, there's things from my childhood that I feel like I remember so clearly that happened before I was old enough to have any of those memories because that story got told again and again and again around the dinner table. So I think, all those stories aside, that character trait in my mom who loved to, rehash a good tale. Yeah, I mean, I don't feel like I'm having an active conversation with my mom day to day, but there are little things that show up, that moment of coming through the door and that trigger to like want to connect, or small things where I'm like, oh, this is something my mom would find funny, or a thing that would have been meaningful, or when I tell a story that she told 50 times because I'm like, oh, this is a go-to tale that I can share in this group of people it'll be a funny quip or something. Those are definitely moments where I like, I appreciate the contribution of our relationship in my life in an ongoing way. I think it's a component of a full life. I've mentioned earlier this like stark before and after moment. And a thing that I have found in my connection with other people now, when the subject of grief comes up, and it's very different for lots of people. I mean, I think grief, that true sort of heart-wrenching loss, it's just a before and after moment in life. It's something like, until you've experienced it, you don't have that rich context to draw from. And I think in the way that you would never wish just an absolute heartbreaking breakup with somebody, we all kind of look at people in their youth and the innocence of love before they've gone through that and be like, oh, yeah, that's, that there's a thing coming and you're going to experience that, and it's going to enrich your life in its own way. And obviously that's not the case for everyone. Some people don't recover from those really hard hits in life. And sometimes they're unfair and unjust. Grief comes with many different flavors. But for me, especially with I think what the quite beautiful deaths that I have got to experience with these two people that really meant so much for me, or to me, it's been an enriching aspect of that perspective on life. It's been an encouragement to like tell the people who matter to me why they matter and that I love them. It's sort of like sucked up the vacuum of wanting to like tread delicately around certain subjects. It's like, let's get into, I'm not assaulting or aggressively approaching random people on the street to talk about deep and meaningful things all the time. But with the people that I am close with, it's just an encouragement to just get into. So what is going on there? Why do you, how are you feeling about that? Is it good? Is it bad? Is it ugly? And I think grief has given me an acceptance of that full experience. I've tried not to rush my own grief or sidestep it, but just allow it to be, a representation of why people matter to us.
Do you think they've healed from grief, or that you live with grief?
Do I think that I've healed, or that people generally heal from grief? Yeah, for me, I don't think it's something I need to heal from. I think it's, again, like as we get older and we get crinkly lines on our face, like it is the fullness of a life lived. I think in the past, death was an abstract concept. Live in a society where death has been, very much moved off into the dark corners of the medical system. And there are people who have sort of taken on that work in geriatric and end of life care. And I think that there's, great people doing great work around that. But, in having spent time in other parts of the world where death is just a more vibrant component of life, I'm glad that I've had the opportunity to engage it more directly, and that I don't wish that for other people. Like, it's when we suddenly come to the other side of this cliff or this experience, when it is totally unfamiliar and we have no frame of reference for it, it's more destabilizing. And I think then it becomes something that we need to heal from, because it's a massive blow, as opposed to living in a society or in a community of people who can recognize that it's part of our life cycle, and that grief is not something to avoid at all costs, or full hard emotions are something to run from. I think I definitely spend more time now, and in this more middle-aged chapter of my life, embracing sometimes things are hard and that's okay. I have a little sort of parallel. We lost a friend to suicide very unexpectedly, and one of my responses to that was to like go and get involved in like a counseling program to work in crisis response, like crisis counseling, and in an odd sort of timing, I literally came out of a workshop around meetings, conversations around suicide, to another very dear friend who was wrestling with some end of life thoughts around some chronic disease and some depression and a layer cake of things. And I think had I not had just lost a friend and been dealing with all of the grief and the anticipatory grief of losing my stepfather's trajectory was very evident in that moment, I wouldn't have been primed to have the conversation to engage with my friend who was giving some indications that she wasn't happy about being in the world and wanted to think about a next step. We had lots of conversations about why, death might be something that she wanted to make a choice around. And I was able to say, look, I don't think you need to stay or not stay for anybody else, but there's a version of this that would be really horrific for the rest of us. And there's a version of this that would be us getting to support you and to be present and to go through this process with some intention, as opposed to getting destroyed with the sudden realization that you've gone and we never got to have any conversations. And so I think that that's a larger chat about what depression and medical assisted dying and chronic health looks like for people who aren't just our elders who fit a more neatly defined box. And it's a complicated subject, but it's one that I'm really appreciative that I was able to have with my friend. And she made the decisions that she made, but in that moment, she got to feel less alone about the process and less needing to do things in secrecy and in the dark, and by transition got to have some support from that. And like, regardless of the outcome, I think that those conversations are much better had with people than by ourselves. Yeah. Brenda Jean Chaddock and Malcolm Manson Chaddock. They were married for 35 years, had a beautiful relationship. My stepdad obviously was my mom's second husband, but they deeply loved each other. And I think one of the gifts for me was being able to, after my mom passed away and my dad had this really beautiful chapter of some pretty selfless support and care for my mom, I was able to offer some care to him. And we had it wasn't a rich dialogue because that the language was being lost for Malcolm. It was a really beautiful moment for us to be able to share some meaningful time together. And I will always cherish that chapter for sure. I had a more active dialogue with my mom for much of our relationship, but stepdads are complicated a complicated relationship for most people. And I think as an adult, my stepdad became a very, very good friend of mine, and I'm quite happy to have been able to have that chapter with him.